Brendan Fraser is an extraordinary actor. He's not just one of the biggest stars of family films of the 90s or a face of cult adventure movies. From the very start, some directors noted a subtle gentleness in him, despite the actor's masculine appearance and seemingly goofy attitude. That real human being vibe helped Fraser find success in Hollywood, only to eventually drag him down. And then, years later, it became the very thing that brought him back. How did it all happen? Why were Fraser's earliest roles often characters who felt like outsiders? What exactly forced him to step away from acting? And why did he truly deserve his Oscar? As a child, Brendan and his family were constantly on the move, living in various locations: Canada, USA, and even Europe. Because of this, Fraser was always adapting to new environments, and humor became his main tool for that. Fraser's first role was in the 1991 film Dogfight, and he had only one line there.
How'd you like to eat my
Charming. Brendan didn't have to spend years stuck in background roles like Jerry Butler and many others. The next year turned out to be a breakthrough already. Somehow the actor landed 2 lead roles at once in completely different projects: the comedy Encino and the drama School Ties. One of these films set the tone for Fraser's career for years, while the other proved he was able to do serious movies as well. Directed by Les Mayfield, who would later go on to make Flubber, Encino didn't impress critics or audiences much. Pauly Shore even won a Golden Raspberry for his role. But the box office told a different story. On a $7 million budget, the film pulled in 41. So clearly, some viewers liked Fraser as the charming caveman discovering a whole new world, just like the actor himself as a child. Interestingly, this role almost didn't go to Fraser. At first, the studio considered Jim Carrey, and even Nicolas Cage showed interest. Fraser's second film that year, School Ties, was on the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of seriousness. It wasn't just young Brendan in the spotlight there. The cast also included Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Chris O'Donnell. Director Robert Mandel told the cast this movie would make them all famous, a promise Damon would later recall more than once in interviews. That was true, but not entirely. Damon and Affleck weren't stars just yet after School Ties. But without that film, their script for Good Will Hunting probably wouldn't have been picked up by anyone, as they sold it on the condition that they star in it. And no crazy success with earning $225 million on a budget of 10 and becoming famous overnight wouldn't have happened. For most of these actors, School Ties was their first major film. O'Donnell, however, had another big role that year in Scent of a Woman, alongside Al Pacino, so he was on his way up regardless. Not for long, though. As for Fraser, the director later said he stood out at auditions, and there was something different about him. Despite the actor's height and broad shoulders, he possessed a certain vulnerability and fragileness, something quite unusual for young, hungry actors clawing their way into Hollywood. Robert Mandel was clearly an observant man, but he had no idea how right he was. School Ties was well received by critics and audiences, but financially it was a disaster, earning $15 million and costing $18 million. By the way, in this film, we could already see him as George of the Jungle. 2 successful films did their job. Brendan started getting more offers, and it was clear already that his choices weren't always the best. Take The Scout, for example. Fraser got a solid paycheck of $1.5 million, but the movie barely made 3 at the box office, which was far from breaking even. Then came a string of failures. With Honors, The Passion of Darkly Noon, and Mrs. Winterbourne all bombed at the box office and were torn apart by critics. The same happened to Airheads, where Fraser starred alongside young Adam Sandler and Steve Buscemi. Call it luck, fate, or just a weird cultural phenomenon. But for whatever reason, Airheads actually became something of a cult hit in the US. And again, Fraser almost didn't get that role. It was originally meant for John Cusack, but he got stuck filming Bullets Over Broadway. Despite this small win, Fraser was in a rough spot by 1996. One more bad move and he could have ended up stuck in straight-to-video releases, or just working at McDonald's register. But next year, the actor landed one of the most important roles of his career. To play George of the Jungle, Brendan turned down the lead role in Inspector Gadget, which ended up going to Matthew Broderick, and that was definitely the right call. Gadget, despite its massive $90 million budget, bombed at the box office and put Broderick's career in serious trouble. Things only got worse for him with The Stepford Wives in 2004, after which his career never fully recovered. So Fraser made the right move, a rare thing for him, as we'll see later. The role of George wasn't unfamiliar territory. Once again, Brendan played the charming caveman discovering a whole new world. Only this time, he was in top physical shape and spent most of the movie shirtless. To prepare, the actor went on a strict diet and trained intensively. He also studied physical comedy masters like Bill Irwin and Buster Keaton. The latter seemed to inspire him not just in movement, but in commitment. Keaton was famous for performing insane, high-risk stunts. Fraser didn't go to such extremes, but he did insist on doing all his own stunts, a decision that would definitely have consequences later. Audience reviews for George of the Jungle weren't exactly glowing, but somehow, the film made $174 million at the box office, against a budget of $55. Perhaps shirtless Brendan had something to do with this result, but that's not certain. More importantly, this was the movie that caught the attention of director Stephen Sommers, who was searching for a lead in his adventure film. But before landing his career-defining role, Fraser took on a few more projects. He once again played the charming caveman, discovering a whole new world in Blast from the Past. By that point, audiences seemed to have had enough of it. So it flopped, as did biographical drama Gods and Monsters, a much less typical role for Fraser, who had already leaned heavily into comedy. The director saw a certain fragileness in the actor, just like in School Ties, as well as a rare ability to listen carefully, both essential qualities for the role. And now what you've all been waiting for. In 1999, The Mummy changed everything. Director Stephen Sommers said he needed an actor who wouldn't take himself too seriously in the role. He believed that the worst thing an adventure film could have was a super serious lead. That's where Brendan's skill for physical comedy and his real human being vibe came in. Unlike most of the typical action heroes, the actor was allowed to actually show fear when facing undead monsters and spooky crap, which made Rick O'Connell feel much more real and lovable. Fraser's agility, which was already on display in George of the Jungle, also worked in his favor, like in this scene, where he was literally fighting empty air. Nobody really believed in The Mummy as a project. Sommers came up with the risky idea of taking the classic 1932 horror film and turning it into an adventure comedy. The studio wasn't exactly thrilled, especially since this pitch was coming from a director whose last movie, Deep Rising, had flopped. Fraser's involvement didn't inspire enthusiasm either, considering he only had 2 box office hits, while the rest of his films earned a pack of chips. As a result, the budget was slashed to the bare minimum, at least for a movie of this scale. The studio also tried to keep a tight grip on production, but that didn't work out. Sommers constantly rewrote the script and made major changes during filming. And of course, there were also accidents on set. In the hanging scene, Brendan actually got choked, so badly that he passed out. Later, the actor claimed in interviews that he was technically dead for about 10 seconds. Usually this kind of chaos leads to a disaster, a box office flop, and the end of someone's career. And that's probably what would have happened to Fraser and Sommers. But the impossible happened. The Mummy was a massive hit, pulling in $418 million worldwide on a budget of $80 million. It became an instant adventure classic and still holds up perfectly, even 25 years later. Brendan immediately became a huge star, and not even the spectacular failure of his other movie of the same year, Dudley Do Right, could stop that. Dudley made it into the top 3 biggest box office disasters of the year, pulling in a glorious $10 million, costing $70. The movie was so bad that without The Mummy, Fraser's career would have likely ended right then and there, just like that of its director Hugh Wilson, actually. Wilson had previously made Police Academy, The First Wives Club, Guarding Tess, and the mentioned earlier Blast from the Past. But Brendan had The Mummy now, so he barely even noticed the flop. His salary skyrocketed to $10 million per film, and that had a noticeable impact on his next project, Bedazzled. Fraser's paycheck alone made up a fifth of the entire budget, and in reality, the movie cost even more because of the actor. Unintentionally, though. Bedazzled was filmed at the same time as The Mummy Returns, meaning the production team had to chase Brendan around the world just to shoot his scenes. That increased costs even further. Post-production didn't go smoothly either. Several scenes were cut to keep the film within a PG-13 rating, but the rating didn't help much. Bedazzled made only $90 million, costing around $50. Maybe without these issues, the movie could have broken even, but it is what it is. Because of Bedazzled, Fraser had to pass on a role in The Wedding Planner. Scheduling conflicts forced him to turn it down, and the part went to Matthew McConaughey, who would go on to play romantic leads for years after this role. Fraser, however, wasn't planning to finish his own flop streak just yet. He kept pushing forward, this time with Monkey Bone. Originally, the project was much darker, and Nicolas Cage and Christopher Walken were attached to it. They were even involved in the script development, but both eventually dropped out. Fraser came in, and the script was heavily rewritten to be more of a comedy. Released in 2001, Monkeybone followed in Dudley Do-Right's footsteps and became one of the biggest box office disasters of the year. With a budget of $75 million, it barely made $7. When you look at disgusted audience reviews, you actually see that this movie was doomed from the start and had no chance whatsoever. Bridget Fonda, who co-starred in the movie, wasn't as lucky as Fraser, and Monkeybone effectively ended her career. Unlike him, she didn't have a second mummy to soften the blow. But who would have thought that the seemingly career-saving The Mummy Returns would quietly mark the beginning of Fraser's upcoming troubles? While working on the sequel, director Stephen Sommers was given full creative control, but with one condition: he had to shoot the movie fast, preferably yesterday. That demand definitely affected the final product. Even the laziest critic punched the sequel for its notoriously bad CGI, especially the giant scorpion with Dwayne Johnson's face. The visual effects team barely had time to work on it. The studio only handed that part of the movie over to them a couple of weeks before the premiere. The team had to finish the effects just a week before the movie hit theaters. For the sequel, Brendan received one of the biggest paychecks of his career, around $13 million. The movie performed just as well as the first one, collecting $443 million worldwide on a budget of nearly $100. But audience and critic reviews weren't as strong this time, and that made the studio nervous. So instead of jumping straight into The Mummy 3, they decided to release Dwayne Johnson instead of Fraser, hoping to expand the franchise. The experiment was not successful, though, so plans for The Mummy 3 were abandoned for several years. Fun fact: later another studio would also release Rock instead of Fraser on the screens, resulting in some serious trouble for Brendan. After redeeming himself with The Mummy Returns, Brendan turned down the sequel to George of the Jungle, and instead signed on for the adaptation of Graham Greene's novel The Quiet American. Critics responded well to the film, but it failed to make back its budget. Again. Around this time, Fraser's personal life started unraveling, and combined with his poor choice of projects, his career took a serious hit. First, his eldest son, Griffin, was born with autism spectrum disorder, which deeply affected the actor. Things got even worse when he lost out on a role he desperately wanted: Superman. Fraser had even met with director Brett Ratner to discuss the project. But then the studio replaced Ratner with Bryan Singer, who cast Brandon Routh instead. For Fraser, missing out on Superman was devastating. In later interviews, he admitted that he struggled with self-doubt after that, constantly asking himself what was wrong with him and why he hadn't been chosen. Then came another incident, one that became much more widely known than the Superman story. According to Brendan at some event, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association president touched the actor in, well, let's just say, in a place where one gentleman usually doesn't touch another. Brendan was horrified and immediately went to the police, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to file a report about it. He later said he felt ashamed and scared, replaying the moment over and over in his head. The experience severely affected his mental state, causing a depression, and he withdrew from public life almost entirely. Fraser was still working in films, though. In 2003, he starred in Looney Tunes, directed by Joe Dante, the man behind Gremlins and Inner Space. The movie was originally meant to be a follow-up to Space Jam, but Dante hated Space Jam so much that he tried to distance his film from it as much as possible. Not that he liked his own project either. He later admitted he had zero creative control over the film and only agreed to direct it as a tribute to his late friend, the legendary animator Chuck Jones. Looney Tunes bombed at the box office, bringing in just $70 million on a budget of $80. Fraser redeemed himself a year later with Crash, a heavy drama where he fit in pretty well. However, critics mostly focused on other actors who racked up nominations for everything from the BAFTAs to the Oscars. The film did win multiple Academy Awards, but Brendan himself wasn't singled out. Still, being part of an Oscar-winning film was undeniably a good thing. Not that it changed much for him, though. After Crash, Fraser mostly worked on tiny indie films that barely made a penny at the box office, and broke our heart in this Scrubs episode. He even starred in A Journey to the End of the Night by Millennium Films, which at the time was notorious for producing straight-to-video action flicks with washed-up stars. By the way, we break it down in our John Cusack video. Unlike Cusack, Fraser was smart enough to walk away just after one film, realizing it was a one-way ticket. Little did he know that this film would actually be a golden ticket for him, but more on that later. In 2005, Fraser almost landed the role of Mr. Fantastic in Fantastic Four, which could have given him another franchise. A questionable one, but still. So for the next few years, Fraser had nothing noteworthy coming out. And in 2007, his personal life took another hit. He divorced his wife, leading to a messy legal battle over assets. And finally, next year came 3 big movies with Brendan. One of them, Inkheart, was a promising fantasy adventure, but it couldn't even recoup its production budget. That left Fraser with 2 other releases that year, The Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor and Journey to the Center of the Earth. Both had the potential to revive his career. But out of the blue, everything fell apart. Nobody really had high hopes for a family-friendly 3D adventure film Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was directed by Eric Brevig, a visual effects specialist who had worked on Men in Black, Pearl Harbor, and Michael Bay's The Island. This was Eric's directorial debut, which likely signaled the film would be more of a visual party for kids rather than anything deep, and that's exactly how it turned out. So the reviews were average, but the box office numbers, they were unexpectedly strong. Journey pulled in $244 million, costing $60. Just for the record, the film made a lot more than the previously mentioned The Scorpion King, which cost the same. The Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor was the 3rd movie for Fraser that year, and it earned even more, $400 million. It also cost significantly more though, $145, but anyways, it was a success as well. 2 box office hits in a row should have boosted Brendan's career, but that's when audience and critic reviews interfered. They hit The Mummy the hardest, and especially because of Rachel Weisz's recasting. There are several theories about why she didn't return. The director claimed she simply didn't want to play a woman with a 21-year-old son. Others believe the actress wanted to stay home with her newborn, though that didn't stop her from taking other film roles that same year. Most likely, Rachel just hated the script and flat out refused to come back. And she wasn't alone. Audiences hated it too. The film scored a brutal 13% on Rotten Tomatoes. This terrified the studio, which was already nervous after The Mummy Returns. Plans for a 4th installment were immediately scrapped, despite the fact that it already had a title, The Mummy: Rise of the Aztecs. Antonio Banderas was even set to play the main villain, but after checking those Rotten Tomatoes scores, the studio backed out completely. Instead, in 2017, they decided to reboot The Mummy with an entirely new cast, putting Tom Cruise in the lead role. That movie also performed well at the box office, and also got torn apart in reviews. As a result, the franchise is currently a mummy itself. But the 3rd part didn't just kill the franchise, it nearly killed Brendan Fraser. He had always insisted on doing his own stunts, but now his body couldn't keep up. In his own words, he had to wrap himself in ice packs just to get through the pain. After filming, Brendan required multiple spinal surgeries, a procedure on his vocal cords, and even a knee replacement. And all of this happened while he was already in a rough mental state. The actor still had Journey to the Center of the Earth in his back pocket. After the first film's success, the studio rushed to make a sequel, and everything still seemed to be peachy. But that's when Brendan shot himself in the foot. Director Eric Brevig was busy with another project, so the studio started looking for a replacement. When Fraser found out, he protested, insisting they wait for Brevig, or he wouldn't do the film at all. The studio, deciding that speed mattered more than loyalty, simply replaced Brendan with the Scorpion King himself. And just like that, the problem was solved. The sequel with The Rock actually made even more money than the original and received about the same reviews, so the studio had no regrets. Fraser, on the other hand, lost what could have been a major franchise, one he desperately needed. And then came 2010, the year that finished off the actor's career. First, Extraordinary Measure bombed, despite starring 2 adventure movie icons. Harrison Ford, already a legend, couldn't have cared less. For Fraser, this failure was unpleasant, but not as terrifying as the next one. For Furry Vengeance, he was paid $10 million, a solid paycheck, second only to what he earned for The Mummy films. But the movie was such a crude and uninspired farce that it was universally hated. Even Brendan himself finally started to suspect something in the switched agencies. But, as you can probably guess, it was already too late. In interviews, Fraser once suggested that his downfall might have had something to do with rejecting Philip Burke's advances. In other interviews, he dismissed the idea and blamed a series of unfortunate coincidences. But let's be real. Dudley Do-Right, Monkey Bone, Furry Vengeance? Was it Fraser who picked up these projects or his agents? But they were truly terrible, and ultimately finished off Brendan's career when he lost his safety net, the Mummy franchise. On top of that, the actor's health issues and depression caused him to lose shape rapidly. For someone whose success was based on playing rugged, adventurous guys, that was basically a one-way ticket out of Hollywood. unless he put in enormous effort to reinvent himself. And that's exactly what he slowly started doing in the mid-2010. Fraser didn't jump straight into his comeback, of course. At first, he kept trying to land the same kinds of roles he used to play. But at this point, calling these projects B category would have been an insult to all B movies. The actor even played an Elvis Presley impersonator in the disaster of a comedy Pawn Shop Chronicles, which flopped on every possible level. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Brendan realized that TV was on the rise, and he made a smart move by shifting there. In 2015, the actor took a role in the miniseries Texas Rising, where he reportedly befriended one of the horses on set, bought it, and took it home. Yes, according to various accounts, including from random fans who have met him, Fraser's apparently just that wholesome. Then the actor landed a more high-profile gig in The Affair. It was a small role, but a powerful one, and it caught the audience's attention, especially since Fraser wasn't playing his usual kind-hearted character, but a real jerk. Suddenly, Fraser was back on the interview circuit. But the actor was so out of practice, seemed so lost and visibly depressed while answering questions, that many who watched this interview were terrified. Later, the actor revealed his mother had passed away just days before the interview, something that only added to his depression. But it was unknown back then, so freaked-out viewers started an online petition demanding Hollywood to give Fraser a decent role. It ended up collecting around 45,000 signatures. Did it have any real impact? Hard to say, but soon after, Brendan showed up in more TV shows, including Trust, Condor, and Doom Patrol, where he played a race car driver who lost his family in a crash and ended up joining a team of misfit superheroes. Fraser didn't completely leave films, though, even if the projects weren't exactly top tier. He even took a role in the Bollywood thriller Line of Descent, replacing Ray Liotta. Of all his films from this period, the most notable was probably No Sudden Move, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Fraser played a gangster in this HBO streaming project, which somehow managed to pack in an absurd number of A-list stars. Unfortunately, the movie suffered due to the pandemic. The production was delayed and several major actors dropped out. Among them were George Clooney and Nicolas Cage. They were replaced by John Hamm and David Harbour. Sadly for Ray Liotta, No Sudden Move was one of the last films he ever made. The film was released on streaming in 2021 and received excellent reviews from both critics and audiences. Around the same time, it was announced that Brendan would star in Darren Aronofsky's new film, The Whale. People were thrilled, predicting a comeback story similar to Mickey Rourke's in The Wrestler in 2008. That's when Rourke made a triumphant return after years of struggling, what he himself described as surviving on $200 per week and selling off whatever was left from his glory days. Aronofsky had been developing The Whale for over a decade, but couldn't find the right lead. Then, by sheer chance, he saw Fraser in previously mentioned Journey to the End of the Night. And that's where he noticed exactly what he was looking for in Fraser. To play Professor Charlie, Fraser spent months training with a choreographer. He also consulted with the Obesity Action Coalition and endured 4-hour makeup sessions daily, sweating under prosthetics that weighed up to 136 kilograms. But the biggest challenge of the role was that it was almost entirely seated, and half of his face was restricted by silicone prosthetics. The same Fraser we're used to seeing screaming, dancing, and crashing into walls had to pull off an incredibly complex performance without slipping into farce, using nothing but the subtle expressions of half his face. And then, well, we all know what happened next. The Whale racked up nominations and awards, and Brendan was at the center of it all. Unlike Rourke, he actually won the Oscar in 2023, becoming the first Canadian actor ever to receive the Best Leading Actor award. Few wins in recent history sparked such a positive response from audiences. Perhaps the closest comparison was Leonardo DiCaprio's long-awaited Oscar win in 2016. But Fraser's victory carried even more emotional weight, given his difficult journey and his raw, heartfelt reaction to the standing ovations and awards. And The Whale didn't just win awards, by the way. It also performed well at the box office, earning $58 million with a budget of $10 million. After his well-deserved triumph, Fraser made a brief appearance in Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, and was also set to play the villain in Batgirl, but that project was scrapped entirely. Last year, another suspiciously low-quality film snuck into Fraser's filmography, the comedy Brothers. Audience and critic scores weren't great, but since the movie was backed by Amazon Prime, financial questions weren't really a concern. Looking ahead, Fraser has some projects in the pipeline. He's set to play President Dwight Eisenhower in Pressure, and is also producing his own passion project, The Legend of William Tell. This adventure action film has been in development for over a decade, so its relevance is questionable, but it's still officially on his list. We can only wish Fraser the best and hope he takes full advantage of his triumphant comeback, rather than slipping back into the cycle of flops that defined much of his career. It's always pleasant and refreshing to see someone like you and me in Hollywood, just a human being with vulnerabilities, not movie sharks, ready to cut throats for roles, prima donnas, or just unreachable geniuses, but someone like Brendan, who made career mistakes, but was kind to everyone and never stopped trying despite all misfortunes. Check out our video about Edward Norton, another gentleman who made some terrible career choices, but unlike Fraser, hardly can be named fragile or gentle. Well, definitely not by the directors and scriptwriters he was working with. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you. Bye for now.